Hello and welcome to part 7 of this series about object-oriented programming. In this second part about class members, I'll introduce class methods, so the methods denoted with the static keyword. That as a sequel to the previous version where I demonstrated the use of class member variables. Implementing class methods in this version 1.7 will be the solution to the problem we had in the previous version. Coming back to that version 6 for a sec, I demonstrated an interesting usage of class members, namely that of counting the amount of instances of a class, which can be achieved by adding a static count member variable and increasing that counter in the constructor, so every time a new object is created. But in the demo I made it public, and by doing so I opened the door to the following problem. Namely that since it is public, any client can read the value, which is good, but can as well change its value, resulting in improper use of that variable and hence create unreliable outputs. Since count is declared public in class rectangle, anyone can just change the counter, resulting in an output which is not correct. So what happens here? First we display the initial count, which is 0. Then we create a rectangle. The count, as we saw in the previous version, is incremented in a constructor. So when printing the count again, it is set to 1. But then the client decides to increase the counter twice and then printing out the value again. So the last line says 3 rectangles created, but it should be just 1. So this is not correct. How to prevent this improper use by the clients? By implementing a fundamental OO concept that I've already handled in the earlier version of Drawing App 1.3, namely encapsulation. In that version I encapsulated the instance member variables x, y, height and width, but never mind instance or class member variables, the same rules apply. If made public and not final, then encapsulate. So here, in order to solve our problem, we need to encapsulate class member variable counts. And how did that work again, encapsulation? Well, we make the data member private and we add a public getter in our case. So data member private and we add a public getter, and that method will be static as well. So we have a class method, which is just doing one thing, returning the value of the count. We don't add a setter, not even with validation. Why not? Well, because we don't want anybody but the rectangle to control the value of that counter. So no setter, just a getter, and that way we make it for clients a read-only property. So the clients will now not be able to change that value, because if we uncomment this line, we will receive a compiler error. Count has private access in rectangle. The only way now the client can read the value is by invoking the static method, so the class method getCount. And we do that by, just as with class member variables, preceding the class member by rectangle dots. So the output will be one rectangle created. In the UML, the only difference with the previous version is that here we make it private, so a minus sign, and we add a static getter, so a class method. A few remarks. First of all, a static method can be invoked without having to create an object first. They are never related to an instance of a class, and since not related to an instance of a class, there is no disport available in the method. So suppose you have this static getCount method, which returns the count static class member. Well, if you try to prefix it with this dot, you would get a compiler error. This cannot be referenced from a static context. And this makes perfect sense. Because as client you invoke the method by prefixing the name of the method getCount by the name of the class, rectangle.getCount. So no reference is being used. And since no reference is used, this would never be able to be initialized, because this implies the existence of an object reference being used. Still, the following is possible. Suppose I have this client which creates a rectangle and it wants to print the amount of rectangles created. So as we saw, you use the name of the class .getCount. Still, this is possible using the object reference syntax .getCount. And the only thing you would get from the IDE by default is a compiler warning saying static member rectangle getCount accessed via instance reference. Now I don't know why they don't make this a compiler error, because I find this code confusing. It affects code readability. If we wouldn't have the previous line, then a person reading this would be tempted to say, okay, I'm using an object reference, so getCount is a non-static method. This affects the knowledge of the class rectangle you are using and makes it all the more confusing. What I do is, in the IDE, I just make sure that the compiler warning becomes a compiler error. If you feel like changing it to an error as well in your IDE, so for IntelliJ, go to the settings, editor, inspections, and there change the topic access static member via instance reference from warning to error. For Eclipse, go to the properties, Java compiler, errors, warnings section, and change the topic non-static access to static member from warning to error as well. Feel free to add any comments why this syntax about using an object reference when using a static member is allowed, because I can't think of any sensible argument. So in the client, what we changed compared to the previous version is, instead of accessing the count class member variable, prefixing it with the rectangle class name dot, we now invoke the class method getCount. So the client prints out the count a first time, then an object is created and printed out. The count is printed out a second time. This is not possible anymore, since the count variable is now private, encapsulated in a rectangle class, and the count is printed a third time. Looking at the output, we now see that the last count indeed remains as 1. 1 is okay, is correct. Time to put all this into practice in a hands-on video. So in the lib package, I'll add a new package demo7 class methods and implement encapsulation in the rectangle class. In the app package, I add the package demo7 class methods as well and test the getCount method in the drawing app client. Now, as a reminder, why do I always create a separate package per version instead of using Git? As mentioned in the Getting Started video, I do this in order to keep the focus on OO and nothing else, just using one tool, namely the IDE. Everything is in the IDE. You get an overview of the different steps just by looking at the packages. Okay, that's for this introduction video. See you in the hands-on video. Bye-bye.